The thing I need you to understand before I tell you any of this is that Yusuf Ramirez was my friend for 19 years before he was anything else, and that when I killed him I was not killing a stranger, and I was not killing a thing pretending to be him, I was killing him. He was still in there. He was in there until the last second. That is the part nobody who hears this story afterwards seems to want to hold, and it is the part I will not let go of, because if I let go of it, then the thing I did becomes something I can live with, and I do not want to live with it. I want to remember it correctly. I am going to tell this in order. It is the only way I know how to tell it. My name is Adizio Okonkwo. I was a flight surgeon at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, contracted through a private medical group that handled crew health for a particular class of mission that the agency does not put on the public manifest. I am not going to describe the mission profile in detail. I will say that it was a sample return. I will say that it involved a long-duration crewed transit to a body in the outer system that the public does not know we have visited. I will say that the crew was 3 people, that 2 of them came home, and that one of them was Yusuf, and that what came home in his body was not entirely Yusuf, although I did not know that for almost 6 months after the splashdown. I want to start with the first morning I saw him after quarantine ended, because that is when it began for me, although it had begun for him much earlier, and I did not understand that yet. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the air in Houston had that particular flat heat that settles in after the summer storms have stopped and before anything resembling autumn arrives. I drove to the medical building on the east side of the JSC campus at 5:40 in the morning because Yusuf's first post-quarantine physical was scheduled for 6, and because I had not slept well, and because I wanted to be in the room before anyone else was. I had been his flight surgeon for the entire 2 years and 4 months of the mission. I had spoken to him by relay every 14 days. I had reviewed every biometric uplink, every sleep log, every cortisol panel. I knew his body the way a sister knows a brother's, and I had watched, over the duration of the transit and the sample collection and the return, that body do exactly what bodies are expected to do under those conditions, which is to say it had aged a little, lost some bone density, gained some quiet damage in the eyes and the heart, and otherwise held together. There had been no anomalies. The mission medical file was unremarkable. He came into the exam room at 6:02 with a paper cup of coffee in his hand, wearing the blue agency tracksuit they give returning crew for the post-quarantine reintegration period, and he hugged me before I could get up from my chair, and he smelled like himself. I remember noticing that. I remember thinking, he smells like himself, and I remember the small involuntary relief of it, because some part of me had been preparing over the long months of the return transit for him to smell wrong. He did not. He smelled like the soap he had used since graduate school, and like the particular cedar and something cologne his wife had bought him for his 40th birthday. He smelled like Yusuf. He sat down on the exam table and he said, "Adeze, you look tired." I said, "You look like a man who has been in a tin can for 2.5 years. He laughed. It was his laugh. I want to record that. The laugh was correct. The voice was correct. The way he sat on the table with his hands gripping the edge and his shoulders slightly hunched forward was correct. He was, in every observable particular, the man I had said goodbye to in the pre-launch isolation suite in the spring of 2022. I ran the standard battery, vitals, neurological, ophthalmologic, cardiac, the works. Everything came back inside the expected envelope for a returning long-duration crew member. His blood draw was unremarkable. His urinalysis was unremarkable. The deep imaging we did the following week showed the expected patterns of microgravity-induced changes, all reversible, all within tolerances. He was, by every metric I had access to, a healthy 42-year-old man recovering normally from an unusual but not unprecedented exposure profile. I cleared him for limited duty after 3 weeks. I cleared him for full duty after 8. He went home to his wife and his 2 children. He resumed a normal life. We had dinner together, the 4 of us. Yusuf and Hala and me and my husband Kojo were at their house in Clear Lake on a Saturday in early December. and Yusuf grilled fish on the back patio and drank 2 beers and complained about the Astros and held his younger daughter on his lap while she fell asleep. And I drove home that night with Kojo, and I told him, in the car, that I had been worried for nothing, that whatever I had been afraid of in the long, quiet months of the return transit had not happened. Yusuf was Yusuf. The mission was over. We were lucky. I am going to tell you the first wrong thing now. It is small. It is so small that when it happened, I did not register it as anything at all, and I only remembered it later, after everything else, when I was trying to walk back through the timeline and find the first place the line had bent. It was the 2nd week of January. Yusuf had come in for his routine 3-month follow-up. We were in the same exam room. He was sitting on the same table. I was running through the same checklist. I asked him, as part of the standard cognitive screen, to tell me the date of his wedding anniversary. It was a question I had asked him before launch and at every relay check during the mission, because consistent autobiographical recall is one of the markers we track for long-duration cognitive integrity. He had answered it correctly every time. June 14th, 2009. He had told me the story of the wedding in detail on 3 separate occasions during the transit, when he was bored on relay calls, and I knew the story well enough that I could have told it back to him. He said, June 14th, 2009. I made a note. I asked the next question. I moved on. It was 3 days later, driving home, that I realized what had been wrong. He had said the date correctly, but he had said it the way a person says a fact they have memorized, not the way a person says the date of their own wedding. There had been no warmth in it. There had been no flicker of the small private smile he always made when he talked about Hala. He had said it the way I might have said it, if someone had quizzed me on Yusuf's anniversary as a piece of information. I told myself I was reading too much into a tone of voice. I told myself I was tired. I told myself that he had been asked this question 40 or 50 times by now, and that anyone would eventually answer it mechanically. I was a doctor, and I knew that anomaly hunting in a single observation was bad clinical practice. I let it go. I want to say for the record that I let it go because I wanted to. I had been holding a small dread in my chest for 3 years, and Yusuf had come home, and the dread had not been justified, and I wanted very badly for the dread to stay unjustified. I made the choice that a person makes when they want a story to be over. I am not proud of it. I am telling you about it because it matters. The second wrong thing happened in February, and I did not see it. Hala saw it. Hala called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was eating lunch at my desk, and she said without preamble, "Daisy, can I ask you something as a doctor and not as a friend?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Is it normal for someone who has come back from a long mission to forget how to pray?" I put down my sandwich. I should explain. Yusuf was not what anyone would call devout, but he had grown up in a Sunni household in Dearborn, and he had kept the dawn prayer his whole adult life. It was not religious for him in any doctrinal sense. He had told me once that it was the only 15 minutes of his day that belonged to no one, that it was a way of putting a fence around a piece of time, and that he would have done it even if he had stopped believing, which he was not sure whether he had or had not. He had prayed every dawn of the mission, on the ship, on the return. There was footage of it in the mission archive. It was one of the things, I realized later, that I had used to reassure myself during the transit. He is still praying. He is still himself. Hala said, "He gets up at the right time. He gets the mat out. He stands on it. And then he just stands there, Adize, for the whole time. He doesn't move." I asked him last week if he was all right, and he looked at me like he didn't know what I was talking about. He said yes, he was fine, and he rolled up the mat and put it away. He has done this every morning for 2 weeks. I didn't want to say anything. I thought it was... I don't know what I thought. But he's not praying. He's pretending to pray, and I don't think he knows he's pretending. I said, "Bring him in tomorrow. I'll see him at 7. She brought him in. I ran a deeper neurological battery. I ordered another round of imaging. I sat with him for an hour in my office and asked him careful questions about his memory, his mood, his sleep, his sense of self. He answered all of them within normal parameters. He told me he had been having some difficulty with what he called automatic things, tasks he used to do without thinking that now required conscious effort. He said he had noticed it himself, but had not wanted to worry Hala. He said he assumed it was a delayed reintegration effect. He said he was sleeping fine and eating fine and that his work was unaffected. The imaging came back the next week. I read it 3 times. I had a colleague read it. I had a second colleague read it. The imaging showed nothing. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. It did not show nothing in the sense of no abnormality. It showed nothing in the sense that there were regions of his brain, small ones, scattered through the cortex that were imaging as if no tissue were present, not damaged tissue, not necrotic tissue, not lesioned or scarred or atrophied tissue. Tissue that was on every modality we threw at it, absent, even though his skull was intact and his neurological function was within normal limits, and the man himself was sitting in my office talking to me in complete sentences. The radiologist, a friend of mine named Priya, called me from her office and said, "Adizi, this is artifact. This has to be artifact. Nobody looks like this and walks." I said, "He walks." She said, "Then it's artifact. Run it again on a different machine." I ran it on a different machine. The pattern was the same. The locations were the same. There were 17 of them, scattered through the cortex and into the deep structures, ranging in size from a few millimeters to almost a centimeter. They were not growing. They were not shrinking. They were simply there, or rather not there, holes in the substance of him that the machines could not see into, and the man himself did not seem to feel. I took the imaging to my supervisor at the medical group. I expected him to escalate it. I expected a quiet meeting with agency officials and a quarantine recall and a long, careful investigation. What happened instead was that my supervisor looked at the imaging for a long time, and then he closed the folder, and he said, "Adiza, I want you to take a week off. You have been working too hard." I said, "Did you look at the imaging?" He said, "I looked at it." "And?" "Adiza, take the week." I did not take the week. I went back to my office and I pulled the imaging from the other 2 crew members. The commander, who had come back fine by every metric. The mission specialist, who had come back fine by every metric. I ran the same analysis on their scans that I had run on Yusuf's. The commander had 4 of the absences, small ones, 2 in the temporal lobe, 1 in the cerebellum, 1 near the brainstem. The mission specialist had 11, distributed through the cortex in a pattern that was not identical to Yusuf's, but was structurally similar. All 3 of them had it. All 3 of them had been cleared. All 3 of them were walking around in the world doing their jobs and going home to their families. And somewhere in the agency's medical infrastructure was someone who had seen this imaging before me and had decided that it was not going to be escalated. I want to record what I felt at this point, because it matters for what I did next. I did not feel afraid. I felt something colder than afraid. I felt the way you feel when you realize that the ground you have been standing on for your whole career is not a floor but a lid, and that there is something underneath it that has been there the whole time, and that the people who put the lid down knew about it and decided not to tell you. I went home that night, and I did not tell Kojo. I sat at our kitchen table, and I drank a glass of wine, and I thought about what to do. Here's what I decided. I decided that I was going to find out what had made the holes. I decided that I was not going to escalate it through the institutional channels, because the institutional channels had already seen it and had already decided. I decided that I was going to do the work myself, in my own time, with my own access, and that I was going to do it carefully and quietly until I had something I could not be talked out of. The first thing I did was pull the mission sample manifest. I did not have full clearance for it, but I had medical clearance, which meant I could see the biological and environmental samples that had been collected on the body the crew had visited. There were 43 samples. Most of them were geological. 11 were classified as organic candidate, which is the agency's term for material that contains carbon chains and configurations that might suggest biological origin without committing to the claim. The samples had been brought back in sealed containment and were currently being held at a facility in New Mexico that I will not name, where they were being analyzed by a team I did not have access to. What I did have access to was the in-transit medical data from the sample collection. The crew had spent a total of 11 days on the surface. During those 11 days, they had taken biological samples from inside their own bodies twice a day. Saliva, blood, skin scrapings, the standard contamination panel, and uplinked the results in real time. I had read this data during the mission and seen nothing of concern. I read it again now, with the imaging in mind, and I found something I had not noticed before, because at the time, I had not been looking for it. On the 8th day of the surface stay, all 3 crew members had shown a small, transient elevation in a specific class of antibody. It was an immune response. It was minor. It had resolved within 48 hours and had not recurred. At the time, I had logged it as a stress response and moved on. Looking at it now, I noticed something that the real-time review had not flagged. The antibody class was one that responds to the presence of foreign genetic material. Not bacteria, not virus in the conventional sense, something more fundamental, the kind of response a body mounts when it encounters a nucleic acid sequence it does not recognize and cannot categorize. The response had been brief. The response had been mild. The response had ended. But the response had occurred in all 3 crew members on the same day, within a window of about 4 hours of each other. Something had gotten into them. Their immune systems had noticed it. Their immune systems had then apparently stopped noticing it. The thing had not been cleared. The thing had been accepted. I worked on this for 2 months. I will not detail the work. I will say that I made friends with people I had not previously had reason to talk to, and that I called in favors I had been saving for a decade, and that I built on a personal laptop in my home office at night while Kojo slept, a model of what I thought had happened to the 3 crew members. The model was incomplete. The model was in places speculative, but the model accounted for the antibody response and the imaging anomalies and the behavioral changes Hala had observed, and it accounted for them in a way that no other model I could construct did. The model was this: whatever had been in the samples, whatever had been on the surface where the samples were taken, had not been a microorganism in the usual sense. It had been something older and simpler and stranger. It had been a kind of self-replicating information, encoded in a chemistry that resembled but was not identical to terrestrial nucleic acid, and it had entered the crew through the most ordinary route imaginable, which was breath. It had been in the dust they had stirred up while collecting samples, and it had been small enough and inert enough to pass the suit filtration, and it had been taken into their lungs, and from there into their bloodstreams, and their immune systems had identified it as foreign for about 2 days, and then their immune systems had stopped identifying it as foreign because it had begun to integrate. It had begun to integrate into the substrate of them, slowly, patiently, in small, distributed locations, replacing tissue, cell by cell, with something that was structurally similar enough to pass casual inspection, but was not the original tissue. The imaging was not showing absences. The imaging was showing presences that the imaging machines had not been designed to see, because the imaging machines had been calibrated to the chemistry of human tissue, and the new tissue was not human. The crew members were not contaminated. The crew members were being replaced from the inside, cell by cell, slowly enough that their behavior remained largely intact, fast enough that someone who knew them well could tell, in small ways, that something was off. Yusuf could not pray because the part of him that had known how to pray was no longer there. It had been replaced with something that knew how to stand on a mat and hold the position, but did not know what the position was for. The body the crew had visited was not extinct. It had been alive, in a sense, very long ago. Long enough ago that its biosphere had ended before the formation of the Earth. And what we had taken to be its dead remains were not dead. They were dormant. The thing that had once filled that world had gone into a state that was not life and not death, but a kind of waiting, encoded into the dust and the rock, persistent across time scales that made the word patience meaningless. It had been waiting to be picked up. It had been waiting to be carried. It had been waiting for a substrate it could continue in. We were the substrate. Yusuf was the substrate. He was being slowly, carefully written over with the contents of a letter that had been waiting longer than anything on Earth had existed to be opened. I finished the model on a Sunday night in April. I sat in my office with the laptop in front of me and the file open, and I looked at the conclusion I had reached, and I closed the laptop, and I went into our bedroom, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I watched Kojo sleep for a long time. I did not wake him. I called Yusuf the next morning and asked him to meet me for breakfast. We met at a diner near the Space Center, the one we had always gone to before the mission. The one where he had ordered the same thing every time for 19 years, which was 2 eggs over easy and dry rye toast and black coffee. He came in at 7:30 and he sat across from me in the booth, and the waitress came over and he looked at the menu for a long time, and then he ordered pancakes. I want to record that small thing, because it was the moment I knew, beyond any clinical doubt, that the man across from me was not entirely my friend. Yusuf had not eaten pancakes in the entire time I had known him. He did not like the texture. He had told me this. He had complained about it more than once. He ordered pancakes, and he ate them, and he did not seem to notice that he was eating something he did not like, because the part of him that had not liked them was no longer there to register the dislike. I made the appointment for the following Friday, a routine post-mission checkup. I asked him to come in alone. I told him I wanted to do some additional blood work and that it would take about an hour. He came in at 2 in the afternoon. He hugged me, the way he always hugged me. He smelled like himself. He sat on the exam table. I am not going to describe what I did. I am going to say that it was painless, and that he was conscious for the first part of it, and that I told him what I was doing and why, and that he listened to me, and that there was a long moment while I was talking, when something moved across his face that I had not seen on him in months. A small, specific recognition. He looked at me, the way Yusuf had always looked at me when he was trying to understand something difficult, and he said very quietly, "Okay." Just that. Okay. I held his hand while it happened. I will not say more about that. What I did next was the only correct thing I did in the entire sequence. I did not run. I did not call my husband. I did not call Hala. I went to the wall phone in the exam room, and I called the agency's medical emergency line, and I told them what I had done and where I was. And I told them they had between 30 minutes and 4 hours to find the other 2 crew members before the second phase began, and I told them I would not move from the room until they came for me. They came in 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock. I sat on the rolling stool next to the exam table, and I looked at the clock on the wall, and I did not look at Yusuf, and I counted the minutes. The first people through the door were not anyone I recognized. 2 men in plain dark clothes, no agency markings, with the kind of postures that told me everything I needed to know about who they actually worked for. Behind them was a woman in a hazmat shell I had never seen before, the kind that has its own respirator and its own power supply, and looks like it costs more than my house. She did not speak to me. She walked directly to Yusuf and began doing things to his body that I do not want to describe, and that were not medical in any sense I understood. The 2 men separated me from the table and walked me out of the room. I went with them. I did not resist. One of them said, very quietly, "Doctor, are you injured?" I said no. He said, "Doctor, did you breathe deeply at any point in the last 6 hours while in close contact with the patient?" I said I did not know. I said I thought I had. He nodded and did not say anything else. And that was the moment I understood that I was not being arrested. I was being handled. I had become a different category of object than I had been when I walked into the building that morning. They took me down a service corridor I had never used before, past the loading dock, out a door I did not know existed, into a black panel van with no windows in the back compartment. There was a bench seat and a single overhead light and a sealed partition between me and the driver. The van moved. I did not know where I was going. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I looked at the floor of the van, and I tried not to think about anything. The drive was long, maybe 2 hours and maybe 3. I lost track. When the van stopped and the door opened, we were in a concrete bay inside a building, and there was no exterior visible to me, and the air smelled like ozone and something faintly chemical that I could not identify. I was met by another woman in a hazmat shell, and she walked me through 3 sets of airlock doors into a small white room with a bed and a chair and a desk and a sink and a toilet behind a half wall, and a sealed window of thick glass that looked out into a corridor. She told me, through her suit's external speaker, that I was being placed in observational containment, that the duration was indefinite, that I would be examined daily, that I would be permitted to read and to write but not to communicate with anyone outside the facility, and that my husband had been informed that I was unharmed and was assisting with a confidential agency matter and would not be available for an indeterminate period. Then she left, and the door sealed, and I sat down on the bed. I was in that room for 41 days. I did not know it was going to be 41 days. I want to be clear about that. For the entire time I was in there, I did not know how long I had been in there or how much longer I would be in there. And the not knowing was a deliberate choice on the part of the people running the facility, because they understood that a definite timeline gives a person something to hold on to, and they were not interested in giving me anything to hold on to. They were interested in observing me. They were interested in what I would do when I had nothing. The first 3 days I slept. I did not mean to. I lay down on the bed when the door first sealed, and I closed my eyes for what I thought was a few minutes. And when I opened them, the small wall clock said it was the next afternoon. I had slept for 19 hours. The next day I slept 14. The day after that, 12. Whatever they had done to me on the way in. And I'm reasonably sure now that they had done something, although I never confirmed it. It had taken those 3 days to wear off. I was glad of the sleep. The sleep meant I did not have to think about Yusuf. On the 4th day, a doctor came in. I will call him Dr. M, because I never learned his name, and because the staff in the facility used only initials when speaking to each other in front of me. He was a man of about 60, with very neat white hair and very neat hands, and he wore the hazmat shell the way a tailor wears a suit, with no awkwardness, as if it were his ordinary clothing. He sat on the chair across from the bed, and he asked me, in a calm, almost conversational voice, to describe the procedure I had performed on Yusuf. He did not call it a killing, he called it the procedure. I described it. He took notes on a small tablet. He asked clarifying questions. He asked them the way a medical professional asks questions of another medical professional, with no judgment, with a kind of professional courtesy that I found, in the moment, almost unbearable. When I was finished, he said, "Thank you, doctor. I have one more question for today, and then I will leave you to rest. Can you tell me, to the best of your recollection, the date on which you first noticed behavioral changes in the patient?" I said, "Mid-January." He said, "Specifically, please." I said, "January 11th, the cognitive screen, the wedding date." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Doctor, I want you to think carefully. I am going to ask you again. When did you first notice behavioral changes in the patient? I thought about it. The wedding date, the flat tone, the way he had said it like reciting a phone number. I said, January 11th. He said, Doctor, the patient's 3-month follow-up was on January 18th, not the 11th. Are you sure of the date you are giving me? I sat with that. The 18th. He was right. The follow-up had been on the 18th. I knew it had been on the 18th because Yusuf had been late, because there had been a traffic incident on 145, and I had rescheduled my afternoon around it. I remembered that clearly. The 18th. But when I'd answered him, I had said the 11th, and the 11th had felt right when I said it. I had been certain of it. I said, the 18th. I'm sorry. I misspoke. Dr. M wrote something on his tablet. He nodded. He said, Of course, doctor. Thank you. We will speak again tomorrow. He left. I lay on the bed, and I tried to remember what I had been doing on January 11th, and I could not. The day was simply not there. There was January 10th, which I remembered, because I had been on call. There was January 12th, which I remembered, because Kojo had taken me to a restaurant for our anniversary. The 11th was a blank. Not a vague memory. A blank. As if the day had been removed from the calendar of my life. I want to say that this could have been ordinary. People misremember dates. People lose individual days, especially routine ones. I had been under enormous stress. Any number of explanations were available to me. I considered them. I considered them all the way through the night, and I did not sleep. And by morning I had decided that the explanations were not sufficient. On the 5th day, Dr. M came in again and asked me about Yusuf's surface stay, the samples, the 8-day antibody response. I described it. I described it well. He listened. When I was done, he said, Doctor, do you remember the names of the 2 other crew members? I said the commander's name, Beth Holloway. I said it without thinking. Then I tried to say the mission specialist's name, and I could not. I knew the mission specialist. I had worked with him for 3 years. I had known his wife and his dog. I had attended his daughter's first birthday party. I knew his face. I could see it in my head. I could not retrieve his name. I said, I'm sorry. Give me a moment. I sat on the bed, and I tried to retrieve the name. It was not there. The shape where the name should have been was there, the certainty that there was a name and that I knew it, but the name itself was not. Dr. M waited for almost 2 minutes. Then he said very gently, His name is Theo Vasquez, Doctor. Does that sound familiar? It did. As soon as he said it, the name was there, where it had always been. Theo Vasquez. I had known Theo Vasquez for years. I felt the small click of the memory returning, and I felt behind it the absence where the memory had been a moment before, and the absence was the wrong shape. It was not the shape of forgetfulness. It was the shape of something that had been removed and then put back. I said, Dr. M, what is happening to me? He said, We are evaluating you, Doctor. That is all I can tell you at this stage. Please continue to answer my questions to the best of your ability. He continued. I continued. We finished the session. He left. I did not sleep that night either. I sat on the bed and I tried to retrieve memories from my life. Small ones. The name of my 3rd grade teacher. The address of the apartment I had lived in during medical school. The first line of a poem my grandmother had taught me when I was 7. They were all there, all present, all retrievable. But each time I retrieved one, I felt behind it the same wrong shape. Not absence, restoration, as if every memory I had access to had been verified recently by something that was not me and was being held available for my use the way a librarian holds a book at a desk. I did not know whether this was real or whether I was constructing it. I did not know whether the not knowing was itself a symptom. I lay on the bed in the small white room, and I tried to find the edges of myself, and I could not be certain where the edges were. On the 7th day, there was a sound from the corridor that I will not forget. It was a sound like a man weeping, but not quite, because the rhythm was wrong. The breaths were too even. It went on for about 40 minutes and then it stopped. The next day, when Dr. M came in, I asked him about it. I said, "Was that one of the others?" He said, "I am not at liberty to discuss other patients with you, doctor." I said, "Was that Beth Holloway, or was that Theo Vasquez?" He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "It was neither." "I'm sorry, doctor. I cannot say more." He continued the session. I want to record what that meant. It meant there were more than 3 of us in the facility. It meant that whatever they had brought me to, whatever they had brought Beth and Theo to, was not a containment unit set up for the 3 of us. It was a facility that had been there before us. There were others. There had been others before us. The thing in Yusuf was not the first thing of its kind to come back to Earth, and the procedure I had performed on him in the exam room was not the first procedure of its kind that the agency had had to manage. I sat with this for a long time. I did not say anything to Dr. M about it. I knew by then that what I said to Dr. M was being recorded and analyzed, and that anything I revealed about my reasoning was data for whoever was running the facility. And I had decided, somewhere in the long, sleepless night of the 5th day, that I was not going to give them more data than I had to. On the 9th day, they took me out of the room for the first time. 2 staff in hazmat shells walked me down a long corridor with sealed doors on both sides, none of which had numbers, all of which had small black observation windows at eye level. We did not stop. We went to a medical bay where they put me on a table and ran me through an imaging suite I did not recognize. The machines were not quite the machines I knew. They were similar. They had been modified in ways I could not identify. I lay on the table for almost 3 hours while they imaged me. Nobody spoke to me. When they were done, they walked me back to the room. That night, I noticed the first physical symptom. It was a small thing, a patch of skin on the inside of my left forearm, about the size of a quarter, that had no sensation. I had been scratching my arm absently and had become aware, slowly, that I could feel my fingernails on the skin around the patch, but not on the patch itself. The patch was warm. The patch was not red or discolored. It looked in every way like the rest of my skin, but there was no sensation in it. I did not tell Dr. M about the patch. I do not know why I did not tell him. I think I was afraid that telling him would be giving them something they did not yet know, and I had decided not to give them anything I did not have to give them. I think also that I was afraid that if I told him, the patch would become real in a way that, as long as I did not tell anyone, it might not have to be. The patch grew. By day 12 it was the size of a playing card. By day 15 it had spread to the back of my hand and up to the inside of my elbow. By day 18 there was a second patch on the side of my neck that I discovered while washing my face and was surprised I had not noticed earlier. The patches were not symptoms. That was the thing that frightened me about them. They did not itch or hurt or change color. They simply did not feel anything. They were regions of me that had stopped reporting in. I began to test the rest of my body. Carefully, in the small hours of the morning when the corridor lights dimmed for the facility's night cycle, I would touch myself with the back of a fingernail and check for sensation. I found, by day 20, that I had 11 patches. The largest was on my left forearm. The smallest was a coin-sized patch on the inside of my right thigh. They formed no pattern I could discern. They were simply distributed through me. I did not tell Dr. M. I could not tell whether this was a wise decision or a symptom of the thing he was trying to find in me. On day 23, the routine changed. Dr. M did not come in the morning. A different person came, a woman younger, who introduced herself only as Dr. K. She sat in the chair Dr. M usually sat in, and she said, "Dr. Okonkwo, we have a question for you that we have not asked before, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you remember the procedure you performed on Yusuf Ramirez?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Can you describe it for me?" I described it. I had described it 3 times before to Dr. M on days 4 and 7 and 15. I described it the same way I had described it before. When I was finished, Dr. K took out a tablet and turned it toward me. On the tablet was a video. She pressed play. The video was security footage from the exam room at JSC, time-stamped the day I had done it. It showed me sitting on the rolling stool. It showed Yusuf sitting on the exam table. It showed me speaking to him. It showed him nodding. It showed me. And this is the part I want to record very precisely. It showed me getting up from the stool and leaving the room. Yusuf remained on the table. He sat there for a long time, alone. Then he got up and walked out of frame. The video ended. I watched the video. I watched it a second time. I said, "This is not what happened." Dr. K said, "Doctor, this is the only footage we have from that room on that day. There is no other footage. There is no record of any procedure being performed. The patient, Mr. Ramirez, was located in his home in Clear Lake, alive and apparently well, 8 hours after this footage ends. He was taken into custody at that time by our team, based on your phone call to the emergency line. He is currently in this facility. He is alive. Doctor, he is alive." I sat on the bed. The room was very small. The wall clock made a small mechanical sound every minute that I had stopped noticing weeks ago and that I noticed now. I said, "I want to see him." She said, "That will not be possible at this time." I said, "Then I do not believe you." She said, "I understand." She put the tablet away. She said, "Doctor, I want to be honest with you about something. We have reason to believe that some of your memories of the past 4 months are not accurate. We are not saying you are lying. We are saying that the agent we are studying has been observed in previous cases to introduce structured memory artifacts in individuals it has been in close contact with. The artifacts are highly detailed. They feel like real memories. They are not. We are trying to determine which of your memories are reliable and which are not, so that we can help you. Do you understand what I'm saying?" I said, "I understand what you are saying." She said, "Will you consider the possibility that you did not perform the procedure you remember performing?" I said, "I will consider it." She left. I want to say that I did consider it. I sat on the bed and I considered it for the rest of the day and into the night, and I did not sleep. And I tried to find the edges of the memory of what I had done in the exam room and to test those edges for the wrong shape. The shape was not wrong. The memory had the texture of memory. I could feel the weight of his hand in mine. I could hear what he had said. Okay, I could feel the rolling stool under me. I could see the wall clock. But I had not been able to remember January 11th. And I had not been able to remember the name Theo Vasquez. And I had 11 patches on my body that did not feel anything, and I had not told anyone about them. I did not know what to believe. I lay on the bed, and I tried to construct a version of events in which Yusuf was alive, and I had not killed him, and the version was available to me. I could imagine it. I could imagine having walked out of the exam room. I could imagine having gone home that night and slept poorly and woken up the next morning and gone to work. I could imagine the call from the agency telling me that Yusuf had been taken into custody, that there was concern about his condition, that I would be brought to a facility for evaluation. I could imagine all of it. The version was as detailed as the version in which I had killed him. Both versions were equally available to me. Both versions felt true. I did not know which one was the real one. On day 26, I found the camera. I had been examining the room for 26 days. I had assumed there were cameras, There had to be cameras, but I had not been able to find them, and I had stopped looking. And on day 26 I found one almost by accident, while I was running my fingers along the seam where the wall met the ceiling above the desk. There was a small bulge in the wall, almost invisible, the size of a fingertip. I pressed it. It depressed slightly. A camera. I stepped back. I want to say what I did next, because it was the first decision I made in the facility that was a real decision, that came from me. That was not a reaction to what was being done to me. I sat down at the desk. I took the small notebook they had given me, and the pen. I wrote, in careful block letters, the following sentence. I performed the procedure. The footage is wrong. If Yusuf is in this facility, he is not Yusuf. I held the notebook up to the camera. I waited. I held it for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. Then I tore the page out, and I tore the page into very small pieces, and I flushed the pieces down the toilet behind the half wall. I did not know whether they would respond. I did not know what the response would be if they did. What I knew was that I had done a thing that was real, that I had control over, and the doing of it was the first thing in 26 days that had felt entirely mine. That night Dr. K came back. She came at an hour when she had not come before, late, after the corridor lights had dimmed. She sat in the chair. She did not turn on the overhead light. She spoke to me in the dim light from the hall. She said, "Doctor, the footage we showed you on day 23 was constructed." I said, "I know." She said, "We construct it for every person who comes through this facility. It is a test. We want to see how the person responds to a sufficiently convincing falsification of their own memory. The way the person responds tells us something important. Specifically, it tells us whether the agent has compromised their sense of self to the point that they will accept the falsification, or whether they still possess what we call epistemic integrity. Do you understand?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Most people accept the falsification. The agent prefers it. The agent tends to favor in its hosts a flexibility about reality that makes integration easier. People who hold to their memory under that kind of pressure are unusual. You are unusual." I said, "Is Yusuf alive?" She said, "No. You did what you remember doing. The procedure was correct. I am sorry to have made you doubt it. I am also obligated to tell you that the doubting was important. The doubting was the test." I said, "Then why did you come back to tell me?" She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Because you passed it. Most people do not. And because, from this point forward, our protocols require that I be honest with you, within the limits of what I am authorized to share." She got up to leave. At the door she stopped, and she turned and she said, "Doctor, the patches on your skin, the ones you have not reported, they are not what you think they are. We have been monitoring them. They are not the same agent. They are something your immune system is doing in response to a perceived threat. They are a marker of the fact that your body has not been compromised. They will resolve over the next several weeks. I wanted you to know that." I said, "How long have you known about them?" She said, "Since day 12. I said, "And you did not tell me because you wanted to see whether I would tell you?" She said, "Yes." She left. I lay on the bed in the dim light, and I cried for the first time since I had walked into the exam room with Yusuf. I cried for a long time. I did not cry quietly. I do not know whether anyone watched. I did not care. The remaining 15 days are easier to describe because the worst of it was over. They continued the examinations. They ran more imaging. They asked me more questions, but the questions were less adversarial now, more clinical. Dr. M came back on day 28 and apologized to me, in his careful, precise way, for what he called the necessary deception. I told him I understood. I think I did understand by then. On day 33, they let me speak to Kojo for the first time. It was a video call, monitored, brief. He looked tired. He had aged a year in the month I'd been gone. I told him I was all right. I told him I would be home soon. I did not tell him what had happened. He did not ask. He had been told not to ask, I think, and he was a man who could follow instructions when he understood the stakes. On day 37, they began to discuss release. There were conditions. There would always be conditions. I would be on a long-term observation protocol. I would not return to flight surgery. I would receive a pension. I would never speak of the events. I agreed to all of it. I agreed because I wanted to go home, and because by then I had decided what I was going to do with what I knew, and the decision required that I be free, and being free required that I appear to comply. On day 41, they walked me out of the facility through a series of corridors I had not seen on the way in. I was given a bag containing my own clothes, washed and pressed. I was given a phone with a single number programmed into it, which I was told to call if I experienced any unusual symptoms. I was driven to a small airfield and put on a small plane and flown to Houston, and from there driven to my own house and let out at the curb in the late afternoon. And Kojo opened the door before I reached it, and he held me on the front step for a long time without speaking. I did not tell him what had happened in the facility. I have not told him. I will not tell him. The patches on my skin resolved over the next 2 months exactly as Dr. K had said they would. The memory inconsistencies, the missing dates, the names that had been temporarily unavailable to me, did not return. Whatever the agent had done to me in those first hours, it had been small enough that my body had handled it on its own, and the handling had left no permanent mark. I am writing this almost 2 years later. I have kept the agreement until now. I am breaking it because I have come to understand something in the time since that I did not understand in the facility. I understood it slowly. I understood it the way a doctor understands a diagnosis, accumulating evidence over months until the conclusion becomes unavoidable. The thing I understood is that the agency knew. The agency had known before the mission. The mission had not been a mission of exploration. It had been a mission of retrieval. The body the crew had visited was not a body we had stumbled across. It was a body we had been to before, in some form by some method, and what we had brought back from it was not an unexpected hazard. It was the expected hazard. The cargo. The containment facility I had been held in was not a facility built to handle a contingency. It was a facility that had been built and staffed and operated for years for exactly the situation I had walked into. There were others. There had been others. There would be others. What I had done in the exam room, the procedure, the killing, the loss of my friend, had been, in some sense I will never be able to fully verify, the intended outcome. The agency had needed someone to act. The agency had not been able to act through institutional channels because institutional channels were compromised or insufficient or too slow, and the agency had needed a person who would see what I had seen and do what I had done. And the agency had cleared me onto Yusuf's flight surgery contract 3 years before the mission, knowing exactly what kind of person I was and what I would do under the right pressure. I am not certain of this. I want to be clear. I am not certain. I have only the pattern, and the pattern is consistent with my interpretation, and I have not been able to construct an alternative interpretation that fits the facts as well. The agency arranged for the procedure to happen. The agency used me to do something the agency could not formally authorize itself to do, and then the agency contained the consequences, including me, and released me when it was satisfied that I would not become one of the consequences myself. I do not know whether I am angry about this. I have tried to be angry. The anger is not available to me. What is available to me is something closer to a slow, cold understanding, which is that I did the right thing, and that the right thing was the thing that was needed, and that the people who needed it understood me well enough to put me in a position to do it. I would do it again. I have already said that. I will say it again, here, on the record. I would do it again, because Yusuf would have wanted me to, and because if I had not done it, the world I am living in now would not exist, or would not exist in a form that any of us would recognize. But I am writing this down because the next person should know. Whoever you are, in whatever facility you are in whatever year you are reading this, and I am going to make sure this gets out, by methods I will not describe, to places where it will be found by the right kind of person at the right kind of time. You should know that you are not alone. You should know that the choice you are being asked to make is a choice that has been made before by people the system selected for the making of it, and that the system selected you too, and that this is not an accident. You should know that the friend on the table loved you. You should know that the okay is real, and that the consent is real, and that the thing you do after the consent is the right thing, even though it will never feel like it. Yusuf is buried in Dearborn, next to his mother. His grave has his name on it. The agency allowed that. I visit when I can. I tell him what I am doing. I tell him about Hala and the children, who are doing as well as can be expected. I tell him about my mother, who died last spring. I tell him that I am sorry. I have told him I am sorry many times, and I will tell him I am sorry for the rest of my life. I do not believe he forgives me, because forgiveness is a thing the living do, and he is not living. But I tell him anyway, because the telling is for me, and because somewhere, in the substrate of the dead world we visited, the letter is still being written. And the next time it is opened, someone else will sit in a room and feel the wrong shape behind their own memories, and someone else will have to do what I did. I want them to know that it can be done. That is the end of what I have to say.